Hello. We trust we are maintaining the proper social distance in this, and this is coming to you from this unofficial radio station, WK, WN, W, no, KNDO, Can Do, and we will read this from our home. I would ask that my assistant please close the door because that will keep the germs out. I will take off my mask and we will continue with the reading of A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And we are reading this with the permission of HarperCollins Publishers. We continue our reading with chapter 11. Excuse me. Now remember, the director has just been identified as the father of John. And so we begin the reading of the chapter immediately after that. After the scene in the fertilizing room, all upper caste London was wild to see this delicious creature who had fallen on his knees before the director of hatcheries and conditioning, or rather the ex-director, for the poor man had resigned immediately afterwards and never set foot inside the center again, had flopped down and called him, and the joke was almost too good to be true, my father. Linda, on the contrary, cut no ice. Nobody had the smallest desire to see Linda. To say one was a mother, well, that was past a joke. It was an obscenity. Moreover, she wasn't a real savage, had been hatched out of a bottle and conditioned like anyone else, so couldn't have really quaint ideas. Finally, and this was by far the strongest reason for the people's not wanting to see poor Linda, that was her appearance. Fat, having lost her youth with bad teeth, and a blotched complexion, and that figure, Ford. You simply couldn't look at her without feeling sick. Yes, positively sick. So the best people were quite determined not to see Linda, and Linda, for her part, had no desire to see them. The return to civilization was for her the return to Soma, was the possibility of lying in bed and taking holiday after holiday without ever having to come back to a headache or a fit of vomiting, without ever being made to feel as you always felt after Peyote, perhaps a reference to peyote, as though you'd done something so shamefully antisocial that you could never hold up your head again. Soma played none of these unpleasant tricks. The holiday it gave was perfect, and the morning after was disagreeable. It was so too, not intrinsically, but only by comparison with the joys of the holiday. The remedy was to make the holiday continuous. Greedily she clamored for ever larger, ever more frequent doses. Dr. Shaw at first demurred, then let her have what she wanted. She took as much as 20 grams a day. Which will finish her off in a month or two, the doctor confided to Bernard. One day the respiratory center will be paralyzed. No more breathing. Finished. And a good thing, too. If we could rejuvenate, of course it would be different. But we can't. Surprisingly, as everyone thought, for on Soma holiday, Linda was most conveniently out of the way. John raised objections. But aren't you shortening her life by giving her so much? In one sense, yes, Dr. Shaw admitted, but in another, we're actually lengthening it. The young man stared, uncomprehending. Soma makes you lose a few years in time, the doctor went on. But think of the enormous, immeasurable durations it can give you out of time. Every Soma holiday is a bit of what our ancestors used to call eternity. John began to understand. Eternity was in our lips and eyes, he murmured. Perhaps a quote from Shakespeare. Eh? Nothing. Of course, Dr. Shaw went on, you can't allow people to go popping off into eternity if they've got any serious work to do. But as she hasn't got any serious work, all the same, John persisted, I don't believe it's right. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Well, of course, if you prefer to have her screaming mad all the time. In the end, John was forced to give in. Linda got her Soma. Thenceforward, she remained in her little room on the 37th floor of Bernard's apartment house, in bed, with the radio and television always on, and the patchouli tap just dripping, and the Soma tablets within reach of her hand. There she remained, and yet wasn't there at all, was all the time away, infinitely far away, on holiday in some other world, where the music of the radio was a labyrinth of sonorous colors, a sliding, palpitating labyrinth that led, by what beautifully inevitable windings, to a bright center of absolute conviction, where the dancing images of the television box were the performers in some indescribably delicious, all-singing feelie, where the dripping patchouli was more than scent, was the sun, was a million saxophones, was Pope making love, only much more, incomparably more, and without end. No, we can't rejuvenate, but I'm very glad, Dr. Shaw had concluded, to have this opportunity to see an example of senility in a human being. Thank you so much for calling me in. He shook Bernard warmly by the hand. It was John, then, they were all after, and it was only through Bernard, his accredited guardian, that John could be seen. Bernard now found himself, for the first time in his life, treated not merely normally, but as a person of outstanding importance. There was no more talk of the alcohol in his blood surrogate, no jibes at his personal appearance. Henry Foster went out of his way to be friendly. Benito Hoover made him a packet of 6-packers of sex hormone chewing gum. The assistant predestinator came out and codged himself almost abjectively for an invitation to one of Bernard's evening parties. As for the women, Bernard had only to hint at the possibility of an invitation, and he could have whichever of them he liked. Bernard's asked me to meet the Savage next Wednesday, Fanny announced triumphantly. I'm so glad, said Lena. And now you must admit that you were wrong about Bernard. Don't you think he's really rather sweet? Fanny nodded. And I must say, she said, I was quite agreeably surprised. The chief bottler, the director of predestination, 3 deputy assistant fertilizer generals, the professor of Feelies in the College of Emotional Engineering, the dean of the Westminster Community Singery, the supervisor of Bocanovskiation. What do you suppose that is? The list of Bernard's notabilities was interminable. And I had 6 girls last week, he confided to Helmholtz Watson. 1 on Monday, 2 on Tuesday, 2 more on Friday, and 1 on Saturday. And if I'd had the time or the inclination, there were at least a dozen more who were only too anxious. Helmholtz listened to his boasting in a silence so gloomily disapproving that Bernard was offended. You're envious, he said. Hempel shook his head. I'm rather sad, that's all, he answered. Bernard went off in a huff. Never, he told himself, never would he speak to Helmholtz again. The days passed. Success went fizzily to Bernard's head, and in the process completely reconciled him, as any good intoxicant should do, to a world which, up until then, he had found very unsatisfactory. Insofar as it recognized him as important, the order of things was good. But, reconciled by his success, he yet refused to forego the privilege of criticizing this order. For the act of criticizing heightened his sense of importance, made him feel larger. Moreover, he did genuinely believe that there were things to criticize. At the same time, he genuinely liked being a success and having all the girls he wanted. Before those who now, for the sake of the savage, paid their court to him, Bernard would parade a carping unorthodoxy. He was politely listened to, but behind his back people shook their heads. That young man will come to a bad end, they said, prophesying the more confidently in that they themselves would in due course personally see to it that the end was bad. He won't find another savage to help him out a second time, they said. Meanwhile, moreover, there was the first savage. They were polite. And because they were polite, Bernard felt positively gigantic. Gigantic and at the same time light with elation, lighter than air. Lighter than air, said Bernard, pointing upwards. Like a pearl in the sky, high, high above them. The weather department's captive balloon shone rosily in the sunshine. The said savage, so ran Bernard's instructions, to be shown civilized life in all its aspects. He was being shown a bird's eye view of it at present, a bird's eye view from the platform of the Charing T Tower. The station master and the resident meteorologist were acting as guides. But it was Bernard who did most of the talking. Intoxicated, he was behaving as though, at the very least, he were a visiting world controller, lighter than air. The Bombay green rocket dropped out of the sky. The passengers alighted. 8 identical Dravidian twins in khaki looked out of the 8 portholes of the cabin. The stewards. 1,250 kilometers an hour, said the station master impressively. What do you think of that, Mr. Savage? John thought it very nice. Still, he said, Ariel could put a girdle around the earth in 40 minutes. Ariel being the fairy in what's the Shakespeare play? The Tempest. The savage, wrote Bernard in his report to Mustafa Mond, shows surprisingly little astonishment at or awe of civilized inventions. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that he has heard them talked about by the woman Linda, his M. Mustafa Mond frowned. Does the fool think I'm too squeamish to see the word written out at full length? Partly on his interest being focused on what he calls the soul, which he persists in regarding as an entity independent of the physical environment, whereas, as I tried to point out to him, the controller skipped the next sentences and was just about to turn the page in search of something more interestingly concrete, when his eye was caught by a series of quite extraordinary phrases. Though I must admit, he read, that I agree with the savage in finding civilized infantility too easy, or as he put it, not expensive enough. Mary? Yeah? And I would like to take this opportunity of drawing your Fordship's attention to. It went blank.
Oh, just keep doing it. See, It's still going.
Well, apparently that disruption was
critical.
was
Hi again.
unwarranted.
By the way, we are Sarah's parents, or Miss Hopkins' parents.
See, where were we? Mustafa Mon's anger gave place almost at once to mirth. The idea of this creature solemnly lecturing him, about the social order was really too grotesque. The man must have gone mad. I ought to give him a lesson, he said to himself, then threw back his head and laughed aloud. For the moment, at any rate, the lesson would not be given. It was a small factory of lighting sets for helicopters, a branch of the Electrical Equipment Corporation. They were met on the roof itself, for that circular letter of recommendation from the controller was magical in its effects. By the chief technician and the human element manager, they walked downstairs into the factory. Each process, explained the human element manager, is carried out as far as possible by a single Bokanovsky group. And in effect, the 83 most noseless black brachycephalic deltas were cold pressing. Brachycephalic, something about the head. The 56 four-spindle chucking and turning machines were being manipulated by 56 anquiline and ginger gammas. 107 heat-conditioned epsilon singlies were working on the foundry. 33 delta females, long-headed, sandy, with narrow pelvises, and all within 20 millimeters of 1 meter, 60 centimeters tall, were cutting screws. Wouldn't you love to be part of a cookie cutter? In the assembly room, the dynamos were being put together by two sets of gamma plus dwarfs. The two low work tables faced one another. Between them crawled the conveyor with its load of separate parts. 47 blonde heads were confronted by 47 brown ones. 47 snubs by 47 hooks. 47 receding by 47 prognathous chins. What is the chin? The completed mechanisms were inspected by 18 identical curly auburn girls in gamma green, packed in crates by 34 short-legged, left-handed male delta minuses, and loaded into the waiting trucks and lorries by 63 blue-eyed, flaxen, and freckled epsilon semi-morons. Oh, brave new world. By some malice of his memory, the savage found himself repeating Miranda's words. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. And I assure you, the human element manager concluded as they left the factory, we hardly ever have any trouble with our workers. We always find. But the savage had suddenly broken away from his companions and was violently retching behind a clump of laurels, as though the solid earth had been a helicopter into an air pocket. The savage, wrote Bernard, refuses to take Soma and seems much distressed because the woman Linda, his M, remains permanently on holiday. It is worthy to note that in spite of his M, senility and the extreme repulsiveness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attracted to her. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to modify and even run counter to natural impulses, in this case, the impulse to recoil from an unpleasant object. I'm going to read that again. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to modify and even run counter to natural impulses. In this case, the impulse to recoil from an unpleasant object, even if it's your mother. At Eton, they alighted on the roof of Upper School. On the opposite side of Schoolyard, the 52 stories of Lupton's Tower gleamed white in the sunshine. College on their left, and on their right, the school community singery reared their venerable piles of ferro-concrete and vita glass. In the center of the quadrangle stood the quaint old chrome steel statue of our Ford. Dr. Gaffney, the provost, and Miss Keat, the headmistress, received them as they stepped out of the plane. "Do you have many twins here?" the Savage asked rather apprehensively as they set out on their tour of inspection. "Oh no," the provost answered. "Eton is reserved exclusively for upper caste boys and girls. One egg, one adult. It makes education more difficult, of course, but as they'll be called upon to take responsibilities and deal with unexpected emergencies, it can't be helped," he sighed. Bernard, meanwhile, had taken a strong fancy to Miss Keat. "If you're free any Monday, Wednesday, or Friday evening," he was saying, jerking his thumb towards the Savage. "He's curious, you know," Bernard added. "Quaint." Miss Keat smiled, and her smile was really charming, he thought, said thank you, and would be delighted to come to one of his parties. The provost opened a door. 5 minutes in that Alpha Double Plus classroom left John a trifle bewildered. "What is elementary relativity?" he whispered to Bernard. Bernard tried to explain, then thought of it better and suggested that they should go to some other classroom. From behind a door in the corridor leading to the Beta Minus geography room, a ringing soprano voice called, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then with a weary impatience, "As you were." "Malthusian drill," explained the headmistress. "Most of our girls are free martins, of course. I'm a free martin myself." She smiled at Bernard. "But we have about 800 unsterilized ones who need constant drilling." In the Beta Minus geography room, John learnt that a Savage reservation is a place which, owing to unfavorable climatic or geological conditions, or poverty or of natural resources, has not been worth the expense of civilizing. A click. The room was darkened, and suddenly on the screen above the master's head there were the penitentes of Acoma, prostrating themselves before Our Lady, and wailing as John had heard them wail, confessing their sins before Jesus on the cross, before the eagle image of Pu Kong. The young Etonians fairly shouted with laughter. Still wailing, the penitentes rose to their feet, stripped off their upper garments, and with knotted whips began to beat themselves, blow after blow. Redoubled the laughter, drowned even the amplified record of their groans. "But why did they laugh?" asked the Savage in a pained bewilderment. "Why?" The provost turned towards him with a broadly grinning face. "Why? Because it's so extraordinarily funny." In the cinematrophic twilight, Bernard risked a gesture which in the past even total darkness would have emboldened him to make. Strong in his new importance, he put his arm around the headmistress's waist. It yielded willowy. He was just about to snatch a kiss or two and perhaps a gentle pinch when the shutters clicked open again. "Perhaps we had better go on," said Miss Keat, and moved towards the door. "And this," said the provost a moment later, "is a hypnopardic control room. Hundreds of synthetic music boxes, one for each dormitory, stood ranged in shelves round 3 sides of the room. Pigeonholed on the 4th were the paper soundtrack rolls on which the various Pydic lessons were printed. You slip the roll in here, explained Bernard, interrupting Dr. Gaffney. Press down the switch. No, not that one, it was corrected the provost, annoyed. That one, then. The roll unwinds, the selenium cells transform the light impulses into sound waves, and there you are, Dr. Gaffney concluded. Do they read Shakespeare? Asked the savage as they walked on their way to the biochemical laboratories past the school library. Certainly not, said the headmistress, blushing. Our library, said Dr. Gaffney, contains only books of reference. If our young people need distraction, they can get it at the Feelies. We don't encourage them to indulge in any solitary amusements. 5 busloads of boys and girls singing or in a silent embracement rolled past them over the vitrified highway. Just returned, Dr. Gaffney explained, while Bernard, whispering, made an appointment with the headmistress for that very evening, from the Slough crematorium. Death conditioning begins at 18 months. Every tot spends 2 mornings a week in a hospital for the dying. All the best toys are kept there, and they get chocolate cream on death days. They learn to take dying as a matter of course. Like any other physiological process, put in the headmistress professionally. 8 o'clock at the Savoy. It was all arranged. On their way back to London, they stopped at the Television Corporation's factory at Brentford. Now, this novel was written in about 1930. The television was just invented in about 1927 or so, not many people would have understood television, but here it is in the novel. On their way back to London, they stopped at the Television Corporation's factory at Brentford. Do you mind waiting here a moment while I go and telephone? Asked Bernard. The savage waited and watched. The main day shift was just going off duty. Crowds of lower caste workers were queued up in front of the monorail station. 700 or 800 Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon men and women, with not more than a dozen faces and statures between them. To each of them, with his or her ticket, the booking clerk pushed over a little cardboard pillbox. The long caterpillar of men and women moved slowly forward. What's in those, remembering the Merchant of Venice, those caskets? The savage inquired when Bernard had joined them. The day's Soma ration, Bernard answered rather indistinctly, for he was masticating a piece of Benito Hoover's chewing gum. They get it after their work's over, 4 half-gram tablets, 6 on Saturdays. He took John's arm affectionately, and they walked towards the helicopter. Lenina came singing into the changing room. You seem very pleased with yourself, said Fanny. I am pleased, she answered. Zip! Bernard rang up half an hour ago. Zip, zip. She stepped out of her shorts. He has an unexpected engagement. Zip. Asked me if I take the savage to the Feelies this evening. I must fly. She hurried away towards the bathroom. She's a lucky girl, Fanny said to herself as she watched Lenina go. There was no envy in the comment. Good-natured Fanny was merely stating a fact. Lenina was lucky in having shared with Bernard a generous portion of the savage's immense celebrity, lucky in reflecting from her insignificant person the moment's supremely fashionable glory. Had not the secretary of the Young Woman's Fordian Association asked her to give a lecture about her experience? Had she not been invited to the annual dinner of the Aphroditeum Club? Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Had she not already appeared in the Feely-tone news, visibly, audibly, and tactically appeared to countless millions all over the planet? Hardly less flattering had been the attentions paid her by conspicuous individuals. The resident world's controller's second secretary had asked her to dinner and breakfast. She had spent one weekend with the Ford Chief Justice and another with the arch community songster of Canterbury. The president of the International and External Secretions Corporation was perpetually on the phone, and she had been to Deauville with the deputy governor of the Bank of Europe. It's wonderful, of course, and yet in a way she had confessed to Fanny, I feel as though I was getting something on false pretenses, because of course the first thing they all want to know is what it's like to make love to a savage. And I'd have to say, I don't know. She shook her head. Most of the men don't believe me, of course, but it's true. I wish it weren't, she added sadly inside. He's terribly good looking, don't you think so? But doesn't he like you? Asked Fanny. Sometimes I think he does, and sometimes I think he doesn't. He always does his best to avoid me, goes out of the room when I come in, won't touch me, won't even look at me. But sometimes if I turn round suddenly, I catch him staring, and then, well, you know how men look when they like you. Yes, Fanny knew. I can't make it out, said Lenina. She couldn't make it out, and not only was bewildered, but was also rather upset. Because you see, Fanny, I like him. Liked him more and more. Well, now there'd be a real chance, she thought, as she scented herself after her bath. Dab, dab, dab. A real chance. Her high spirits overflowed in song. Hug me while you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snugly bunny. Love's as good as Soma. The secret organ was playing a delightfully refreshing herbal capriccio, rippling arpeggios of thyme and lavender, of rosemary, basil, myrtle, tarragon, a series of daring modulations through the spice keys into ambergris, and a slow return through sandalwood, camphor, cedar, and new-mown hay, with occasional subtle touches of discord, a whiff of kidney pudding, the faintest suspicion of pig's dung, back to the simple aromatics with which the piece began. The final blast of rhyme died away. There was a round of applause. The lights went up. In the synthetic music machine, the soundtrack roll began to unwind. It was a trio for hyper-villain, supercello, and oboe surrogate that now filled the air with its agreeable languor. 30 or 40 bars, and then against the instrumental background, a much more human voice began to warble, now throaty, now from the head, now hollow as a flute, now charged with yearning harmonics. It effortlessly passed from Gaspard Forster's low record on the very frontiers of musical tone to a trilled bat note high above the highest C, to which, in 1770, at the Ducal Opera of Parma, and to the astonishment of Mozart, Lucrezia Borgiari, alone of all the singers in history, once piercingly gave utterance. It's interesting that he mentions an event that would that predeceased them by a couple of centuries, and was in the classical vein, which you wouldn't think that they would know about, since nobody read Shakespeare. Sunk in their pneumatic stalls, Lenina and the savage sniffed and listened. It was now the turn also for eyes and skin. The house lights went down. Fiery letters stood out solid and as though self-supported in the darkness. 3 weeks in a helicopter. An all-super-seeing, synthetic talking, colored, stereoscopic feely with synchronized scent organ accompaniment. Take hold of those metal knobs on the arms of your chair, whispered Lenina. Otherwise you won't get any of the feely effects. The savage did as he was told. Those fiery letters, meanwhile, had disappeared. There were 10 seconds of complete darkness. Then, suddenly, dazzling, and incomparably more solid-looking than they would have seemed in actual flesh and blood, far more real than reality, there stood this stereoscopic images locked in one another's arms of a gigantic Negro and a golden-haired brachycephalic beta plus female. The savage started, that sensation on his lips. He lifted a hand to his mouth. The titillation ceased. He let his hand fall back on the metal knob. It began again. The scent organ, meanwhile, breathed pure musk. Aspiringly, a soundtrack superdove cooed, woo, woo, and vibrating only 32 times a second, a deeper than African bass made answer. Ah, ooh, ooh. The stereoscopic lips came together again, and once more the facial erogenous zones of the 6,000 spectators in the Alhambra tingled with almost intolerable galvanic pleasure. Ooh. The plot of the film was extremely simple. Hang on one second. Hey, Mary? I don't know. I mean, it stopped. The picture is frozen.
Good. Okay. Oh, no, it's still recording. Okay, get up. Oh, maybe it isn't recording. Okay. All right. Okay. 34:50. No, okay. Wait, stop.